everyone. How are y'all doing today? Good. Unfortunately, I didn't get my, I'm not sure if you have this in your booklet or not. I hope it's right. So let's start talking about the application. First of all, we can't really talk about changes to the application without talking a little bit about EDGAR. I don't know, hopefully all of you have heard about the federal regulations that govern education by now called EDGAR. But there have been some changes in EDGAR that specifically impact the application. So, first of all, advisory councils. In the past, we had a line in the Perkins application that allowed you to budget for supplies and materials for advisory councils. The EDGAR says that advisory councils, expenses for advisory councils are only allowable if specifically allowed in the federal legislation. So we've changed that part of the application a bit. Program, we'll get to those changes in a few minutes. Program income. Program income, this is the 200.80 is a citation from EDGAR. Program income is defined as income earned by the non-federal entity that is directly generated by a supported activity or earned as a result of the federal award during the period of performance. In the past, some of you have used Perkins funds for learning experiences that resulted in earning income for the program, such as operating a restaurant, operating a meat packing plant. Under EDGAR, the way it stands now, in the past you could take the income and add it back to your program. Though under EDGAR now, EDGAR says that you have to subtract that income from your grant award, which means reducing the amount of your grant award or sending us a refund. We're waiting for clarification from the Department of Ed on this. I had a conversation with them a couple of weeks ago, and it's the CTE or the OVA's judgment that doesn't apply to formula grants. So we're waiting for them to send guidance to us about that. But just so you know, you may hear something about this, but at this point, EDGAR doesn't allow you to put that income back into your program. Now, if you're funding those income-producing activities with state funds rather than federal funds, that's great. EDGAR doesn't apply to that. You can still use that income that your program generated and put it back into the activity that generated it. Okay. Installation of capital assets. This is pretty big. Under EDGAR, grantees can now use grant funds to pay for installing the capital asset. Before, we told you that you could use Perkins to buy the capital asset, but if installing that asset involved cutting a hole in a wall or constructing something, you couldn't use your Perkins money to do that. Now you can. That doesn't mean that you can build a building just to house the asset you're buying. It has to be reasonable and necessary. So, for example, the example here is if you want to convert a traditional CTE lab to a culinary kitchen and exterior venting is required. You can now use your Perkins funds to hire someone to cut that hole and do the construction that's necessary to install that vent. But you can't use Perkins money to buy the building for your standalone kitchen somewhere. Another thing I wanted to point out in EDGAR is that it requires internal controls to ensure that funds, property, and other assets are safeguarded against loss from unauthorized use or disposition. And the language it says in the second bullet here is effective control over and accountability for all funds, property, and other assets. So you need to make sure you have controls in place in your district to account for all of your equipment, even down to the wrenches in the auto mechanics lab. Make sure you have that safeguarded so it doesn't walk away. Every year we get calls from a few districts who check their tool inventory at the end of the semester and realize that 95% of their tools had walked off. So you need to safeguard those a little, make sure you have good safeguards. And also related to the application, TEA has something called the Federal Flexibility Initiative. Our commissioner, I believe, has worked at the Department of Ed and with our division to implement this. The big news for you here is that in the past, if you've made a large purchase late in the grant period, we would warn you that it might be subject to careful scrutiny by our monitors or auditors, that there's an automatic assumption that a large purchase made late in the grant year is probably not an allowable use of funds. Now, under our flexibility initiative, we'll evaluate all those requests on a case-by-case basis and request justification that the purchases benefit the grant program. The bottom line is that the purchases have to be directly allowable for the grant program. They have to be allocable, that is, it benefits the grant program, and it has to substantially benefit the students served by that program. So what does this mean for you right now under the current grant year? Everyone's worried because we're in the last month of the grant. It ends in a couple of weeks. This means you can order capital purchases toward the end of the grant period, which is currently June 30th, and remember that currently because that's going to be a really big term in a few minutes, and receive and install them after the ending date of the grant. Now, just as an example, I want to read you, if I can find it here, a sentence that's in the current NOGA award letter that you got this year. This is what the language used to say. This is the legally binding NOGA award letter you get when we send you your little check, your little certificate. All goods and services purchased with grant funds must be received in time to substantially benefit the project and intended beneficiaries during the grant period for which the funds were awarded. Equipment purchased with grant funds must be received, installed, and put into service before the ending date of the grant period. That sentence is not going to be in your new NOGA award letter. So you have more flexibility with how you're going to order funds and or order your equipment and when it's going to be installed. Now, goods and services still have to be received by the final and revised final expenditure report date. And unless you're in the business office, you may not know this, but your final expenditure report date is 30 days after the ending date of the grant. So for a grant that ends June 30th, that would be July 30th. And the revised final expenditure report is due a month after that. So you have a full 60 days to liquidate your obligations. Under this flexibility initiative now, you could also have that 60 days in which to receive the equipment that you've ordered. Okay, now here's the big news of the day. Some of you may have heard about this already. For a number of years, the Perkins grant has ended on June 30th. We've given you your NOGAs. Assuming you submit the application by July 1, you've had one full year to use those funds, from July 1 up to June 30th. We're now extending the ending date of that period by 45 days. So instead of having use of those funds for just 12 months, you'll now have use of the funds for 13 and a half months. That should be a big help to districts who aren't quite sure how to fund participation in summer conferences. It'll be a big help if, in the past, you've ordered equipment, but in order to install that equipment, you probably have to find something else for those kids to do while the equipment is being installed. Now you'll be able to order the equipment and install it over the summer. So that should also be a huge help for some programs. You don't have to worry about how you're going to fund your participation in summer conferences now. You will have 2 grants running concurrently. Assuming you submit your grant by July 1, you will have 2 grants running concurrently for July 1 to August 15th. So you have to be really careful with how you spend the money. You can't use your prior year funds for something that was approved in the current year application, but not the prior year application. So that introduces another level of complexity, but it should be workable. Okay, now we'll talk about changes to the application itself. There really aren't that many, but the few there are pretty significant. First, we used on the first page of the budget schedule, we used to tell you you had a planning amount, an incentive amount, and then a reallocation amount. We're trying to standardize our terminology across different grant programs, and because NCOB and IDEA both issue planning amounts, and then a couple of months later, they do an adjustment and they have a final amount, and then a few months later they have a reallocation. So it was decided that all three of the grants would now post the initial awards as a final amount. So if you see final, that doesn't mean you're not getting a reallocation. That's just a term. That's just a term on the application. But just so you know that that is a change. When you open your application, you'll see a dollar amount in your final amount. If you've done well on your incentive award, or on your Perkins performance measures, you'll see a dollar amount in the incentive column. And almost everyone out there will get some portion of an incentive award. If you meet 5 performance measures, you'll get a full incentive award, and if you meet 4 out of the 5, you'll get an award that's proportionally a bit lower than if you met all 5. All right, another change is on the professional and contracted services schedule, 6,200. The Department of Ed has been letting us know for years that we can't use Perkins funds in the name of individual students. That's why we don't let you use Perkins to pay for licensing and certification fees on behalf of individual students. The same also applies for post-secondary tuition. You can use your Perkins funds for post-secondary tuition for the students, but only if it's not in the name of the individual students. You have to make sure that whatever financial arrangement you work out with the university includes a block of students and not in the name of individual students. Okay, supplies and materials. You'll see that the line for, if you look at your handout, let me find mine here. You have a single page handout that looks like this. This is a page from the new application. On this single page are most of the changes I'm going to talk about. But if you'll notice, you'll see a tiny, tiny little part 6 in the middle of the page. That's where you'll put all of your supplies and materials costs. We don't give you any extra lines, nothing, just add them together and write them there. We used to have a line there for supplies and materials for advisory councils. We no longer do. Now, the Perkins guidelines, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, say that you can use your Perkins funds for advisory councils under specific circumstances. There's a new list in the guidelines that gives you detailed requirements for those advisory councils. If the advisory councils meet that requirement, meet all those requirements, then you can use Perkins funds for them. If not, you can't. If you do need to budget supplies and materials costs for those advisory councils, just group those costs together with your other supplies and materials and put them on the line in Part 6. Now, EDGAR, the reason for that is EDGAR says the cost incurred by advisory councils or committees are unallowable unless authorized by statute, the federal awarding agency, or as an indirect cost where allocable to federal awards. The language you'll see in the guidelines for allowable advisory committee expenses are taken directly from the Perkins law. Perkins doesn't specifically say that you can use the funds for advisory councils. It does say that you can use it for outside groups that assist you in doing certain things like developing, implementing, and evaluating the program. So we felt that that language was close enough to an advisory committee that it was applied. We were applying it to the specific definition of advisory committee. And remember, single items or groups of items that function as a unit that are valued at $5,000 or greater must be budgeted as capital outlay. Now, just a caveat there. If you're buying a computer lab and you're purchasing a bunch of individual components, and they're all under $5,000, that's supplies and materials. If you're contracting for a new lab, buying everything together on the same invoice, that's going to be capital outlay. So there's a little distinction there, and if you're not sure where that falls when you're purchasing components for a lab, let us know, and we'll run it by our auditors to make sure that you're in the clear on it.
In regards to like curriculum, purchasing of curriculum, if there's several different things that fall within, there's a $2,500 fee for online test
I think it's going to depend how it's budgeted on your invoice. But for the most part, everything, if those components are under $5,000 or your capitalization level. Now, there are some districts with very low capitalization level. For some of you, most of you, it's probably $5,000. But if it's valued at less than $5,000 and say your district's capitalization level is $1,000, then you'd still have to capitalize it. So there's definitely some distinctions there. But if you have a specific scenario, just contact us and we'll work with you to figure it out. Further down your Siegel sheet, other operating costs. In-state staff development travel and/or training costs for CTE teachers or LEA staff. Approval is no longer required, so we've deleted that line from the application. Publication and printing cost. EDGAR is very flexible on publication and printing costs. So we used to have a line on the application where we ask you about publication and printing costs. That's not there anymore. And approval is no longer required, as long as those expenses are necessary and reasonable, then you can budget your money for it. So we've deleted that line. Travel for officials is not allowed for Perkins anymore, and we've deleted that line. By officials, we mean superintendents, maybe your local school board members, other folks like that. I think that's meant to discourage instances that we hear about periodically of, say, a superintendent who hasn't shown much interest in your program until he finds out that ACTE is being held in Las Vegas. Then they're suddenly very interested and want to come along to Las Vegas. Membership dues in civic or community organizations excludes CTSOs. We don't mean CTSOs here. We mean like the Rotary Club, the Kiwanis, if your program wants to purchase a membership with those organizations. That's no longer allowed. So, out-of-state travel for employees. It's allowable for Perkins and requires prior approval on the application. It must be minimal and directly related to the grant. Now, here's something very new, and this is also in your packet. It's this lovely form that looks like this. That's a new form that's going to have to be submitted with your Perkins application if you want to spend money on out-of-state travel for employees or educational field trips. So what you would do, there are links in the program instructions and also in the guidelines to a portion of our website that contains these forms. So if you do want to spend money on out-of-state travel or educational field trips for your students, we need to know about it and approve it on the application. And so you would download this form, fill it out, and attach it to your Perkins application. And, okay. Same, now for educational field trips, again, we require prior approval. So you're going to have to give some thought in advance to what kind of field trips you may want to do and how they're related to your instructional program. And you may have to do an amendment during the school year if you want to add field trips. So this is just a heads up in advance. That is new. Yes?
Does that include trips we're doing with CTSOs, like when students go to nationals and stuff like that? Or is
That's not a field trip.
okay.
And you can't use Perkins money for that anyway. So
Local funds that we're using for that.
you have to use your local funds or funds that your CTSO raises.
Okay. So what would be an example of a field trip that we would use Perkins money?
Maybe you want to, if you're in the Panhandle, maybe you want to take your kids to Pantex, the big nuclear facility up there, to tour their operations.
Our engineers would go to the nuclear community, plant,
Right.
or health science kids downtown to the medical center.
Right. And on the form for the field trips, you'll also have to show the TEKS that's related to and the duration of the instructional component. I think part of the reason that TEA management decided to implement it to this detail was the large number of field trips we were seeing to places like Six Flags where the kids spend 5 minutes on the roller coaster. And that's studying physics, and that's very valuable. But do you really need a 2 or 3 day field trip for the 5 minutes of instructional time. So, yes, ma'am.
Is it limited 9 through 12, or can we utilize it for the intermediate and middle school levels too?
Perkins can be used at middle school level.
But not intermediate, only 7 and 6?
Yeah, 7 and 8. Okay.
Rebecca, you can hear everybody thinking at the table.
I know. This is all new. I know it takes some thinking, thinking through. Okay, more other operating costs. Non-employee costs for participating in conferences. This is a separate line item because the EDGAR says that for non-employees, for you to use federal funds to pay for non-employees participating in conferences, it requires authorization from the federal awarding agency, not TEA, the federal awarding agency. And if you choose to budget funds in that line, you're telling us that you are certifying that you have that authorization on file. We're not going to ask for it for you. You have to have it on file. And I don't know if the Department of Ed is set up to do this. I doubt it. But if you do want to use it for that purpose, you're going to have to ask them directly. And Diane and I could give you a contact in Washington to talk to about it. I'm sure they'd be happy to hear from you, or maybe not.
Rebecca, a question came up on the side of the room. Remember, everything that's in this presentation refers to Perkins money only, not your local.
Right. If we have a chance, we'll go over a few things. And it's getting pretty late. But if you take a look at your program guidelines, there's a whole section there now on allowability of things like field trips and hosting conferences and sending your officials to conferences. Now, hosting conferences for non-employees. It says decision on allowability pending. This was done a few days ago. We know now that Perkins, you cannot use your Perkins formula funds to host conferences for non-employees. Other Perkins funding sources, we are allowing you to do that, but not with your formula funds. Now, this does not apply to fiscal agents of shared services arrangements. This doesn't mean that the fiscal agent can have its members in for a meeting to talk about the grant application. It just means that if you're an independent, you can't invite non-employees in for a conference. So we're not really sure why you would want to do that anyway, but there you go. Debt service, no changes to that. Capital outlay, we've revised the language in some of the sections, but we haven't added or deleted anything from that schedule. And then some helpful resources. It's probably nothing new to you here. We want you to bookmark the administering a grant page because there's a lot of information on there, including links, a link that'll take you to a page where you can download these forms. And we want you to join the Perkins and Grants Administration Listservs. We sent out a listserv this morning. Most of you probably didn't get it unless you get your office listserv on your phone. But we sent out a warning this morning that there's an issue with the Capital Outlay schedule. So it's really important to be on the Grants Administration's listserv as well as the curriculum listserv, because we do send out little advisories now and then on that may help you complete the application. By the way, we hope to have that Capital Outlay issue fixed tomorrow. The programmers say they're working on it really hard. And if you have questions, you can send them through the TEA help desk. If it's a CTE question, I'll get it. I'll get it through the help desk. And Diane Salazar is the contact for program, or you can contact me directly. And it looks like I'm in the end of my time, so I guess we won't go over the guidelines. But we'll get something else together for you on that. Well, thank you very much. Any questions, real quick? Okay, thanks. All right.